Well, thank you. It's such a privilege to be here, and it is amazing to have so many people come out this evening. I appreciate it very much. I will apologise. As you can tell, I am not Welsh. I unfortunately do not speak Welsh, much as I wish I did. And I apologise in advance if I butcher some of the place names and because I've written about Aberangell and the district, but I rarely hear the names spoken because I live so far away. So I will attempt my best, and please forgive me where I fall short. I'm going to talk about the Hendre Ddu Tramway, which ran from the village just down, in fact from Mark's house at Penpentre, all the way up to Hendre Ddu Quarry, about 4.5 miles away. And this is perhaps my favourite image of the tramway. The gentleman on the left is Edward Hurst Davis, who was perhaps the most influential Welsh person in this story. And this is a story of the Welsh and the English together, bringing industry to this part of Wales through the slate quarries, through the forestry work, and through the tramways that connected them. I think he looks just wonderful there, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. But I'm going to start with a very brief history of the tramway. As I hope most of you know, I have written a book on the subject, and so if you really want to delve a little deeper, I'd recommend Dan Quine's book. It's pretty good. Quarrying started at Hendre Ddu, at least commercial quarrying started in 1864. Shortly afterwards, the Mawddwy Railway opened, which was a railway that connected Dinas Mawddwy to Cemmaes Road. In 1873, the quarry at Hendre Ddu was, they started working underground and really started expanding it into a major commercial operation. And in 1874, they built the tramway, which was a narrow gauge horse and gravity work tramway running from the quarry down to the station at Aberangell, where it met the Mawddwy Railway. It was built by a gentleman called Sir Edmund Buckley, who is a somewhat notorious character. He built both the Mawddwy Railway and the Hendre Ddu Tramway. We'll talk a bit more about him in a couple of slides. But interestingly, in 1876, just after he opened the tramway, he went spectacularly bankrupt, owing more than £500,000, which in 1876 was a lot of money. Now it's a lot of money. It's about £52 million in current day money. So he went very spectacularly bankrupt. And the tramway was sold off in what was called at the time the Great Sale of Dinas Mawddwy, and you can see one of the catalogues from that sale there. And he sold the tramway and the quarry and actually a lot of land, and we'll talk about that in a moment. In 1880, a second quarry at Garthainiog was opened up, and followed shortly afterwards by another quarry at Meisygamfa. And so you had these three major slate quarries all connected to the tramway, all sending their slate down to Aberangell to be shipped out over the Mawddwy Railway to all over the country, into ports and lands beyond as well. Just before the First World War, Meisygamfa closed, and the First World War was a major change in the history of the tramway and the industries of Aberangell. This is, excuse the projection is slightly blurry, but this is one of the maps from my book showing the tramway around 1900, so just before the First World War. And you can see from Aberangell all the way up to Hendre Ddu, Garthainiog and Meisygamfa quarries. And you can see the sort of the network of tramways that served all of these different industries. And it was an interesting enterprise because it was originally built just as a private railway to serve one quarry. And as other quarries started up in the region, they connected. And there's a lot of very interesting history about how those connections happened and why the owners of Hendre Ddu and the tramway allowed their local rivals to also use the tramway for their transportation. Now, during the First World War, the slate industry declined as quarrymen were called up to service. It became harder and harder to run the quarries. But instead, timber production became very important. And this very interesting gentleman called Henry Sharrock Higginbottom, which is one of the more wonderful names you might come across, bought the rights to timber felling in all of the woods in Aberangell. He was a colliery owner from the northeast of England. He was an MP. He was the son-in-law of Sir William Hartley, the owner of the Jam Empire. And he basically bought up rights to timber across mid Wales so that he could get pit props for his collieries. He was the largest private colliery owner in England at the time, and he needed an enormous supply of pit props. And the forests around here were particularly suitable for providing pit props. So he basically took over the tramway, extended it out into the woods, and operated at least 10 sawmills at various times in the forests here, and sent thousands of pit props down across the tramway, which were loaded onto the Malmesbury Railway and shipped out to his collieries across Wales and the northwest of England. Timber operations lasted into the sort of late 1920s, so it continued on past the First World War. But this really saved the tramway. I think if this had not happened, if the timber operations hadn't happened here, the tramway would have closed around the start of the First World War. Instead, it was maintained, extended, and was able to continue operating after the war. So here's a couple of interesting shots from that time. And the gentleman in the rather splendid raincoat and hat is Henry Sharrock Higginbottom. And there's a sawmill at Aberangell, which was quite a large operation. And you can see he made major changes to the station to provide a space for his pit props to be stored and then shipped out on the Malmesbury Railway. And to give you an idea of the extent of the timber operations, this is just sort of the eastern part of the tramway, and you can see, first of all, these darker shaded areas are all the areas of woodland that were felled during the war. So vast areas were just stripped completely bare and left as open land instead of forest. And all of these additional tramways that he laid up there to be able to access the sawmill. So he would go in, they would saw down the trees, they would create pit props out of them, they would leave them for about 6 months to season, and then they would lay a tramway in and pull all the stock out, seasoned wood, and that would get sent out, and then they would extend the tramway to the next sawmill, so that these sawmills were always sort of ahead of where they were laying the rails to get them out. Going into like Cwmcors, which is a very narrow, difficult to access site, and able to supply these vast numbers of pit props throughout the war. And then in the period up to the Second World War, really both Hendre Ddu and Garthainiog quarries were revived after the end of the war. We'll talk a little bit about Edward Hurst Davis, but he had ended up owning both the quarry and the tramway. He sold it to a company called National Welsh Slate Quarries, who went spectacularly bankrupt less than a year after starting their ownership of the quarry. There's a very interesting story there, which we'll get into in a moment. And then English owners from the East Midlands, particularly Melton Mowbray, took over, formed Hendre Ddu Slate Quarries. In 1937, T. Glyn Williams, which is a name that some of you may recognise, bought Hendre Ddu as a young man. He went on to do some very interesting work in the slate industry. And he closed the tramway in 1938, replacing it with lorry transportation up into up into the valley. Garthaniog, which is the other quarry that really continued after the First World War, was bought by an interesting company called the Standard Housing Company, who again, within a year, went bankrupt. And I'll tell you the story of that. And then a woman called Gertrude Russen bought Garthaniog and continued to run it, leasing it out to various interesting people during the 1930s. One of the few women to own a Welsh slate quarry. But Garthaniog closed in 1937, and that was really the end of slate quarrying in this area. Although timber became a big industry in again in the Second World War, much as it had in the First World War, and again there was a huge amount of activity around some of the tramways, and some of the tramways were relayed during the Second World War. So that's a really, really basic sort of history, just to orient us a little bit to what happened. What I want to do, though, is start to talk a little bit about some of the people, some of the things, some of the stories, because I think those are really what are interesting about some of this. So first of all, some interesting facts about the Hendre Ddu Tramway itself. From 1874 until 1921, so for a long span, it was operated entirely by horses hauling trains up, empty trains up, gravity working down, so the loaded trains would come down by gravity. And there were some very interesting wagons called the cargwyllt, the wild cars, which were human powered. So the quarrymen would push these up the track in the morning, and they would ride down by gravity at the end of their day. And these were, I think, probably fairly exciting. There was a fatal accident in 1877 where one of these was driven too quickly, came off the tracks, killed one of the occupants and severely injured several of the others. There was a public inquiry. So in 1877, the government suggested that the tramway stop using these because they were far too dangerous. They were still being used in 1937 when the tramway closed. So officialdom did not spoil the enjoyment of those who liked coming down the tramway at great speed, hurtling along with only a band brake to sort of slow their progress. So I think these were very much sort of a unique part of the Hendre Ddu Tramway. You'll see in the bottom right is what's called a gradient map. So this shows the slope of the tramway as it comes from the bottom of the Hendre Ddu incline all the way down to Aberangell. And there's two interesting things here. First of all, you can see that it's sort of basically a continual gentle downhill slope, which allowed them to work down under gravity power, just with brakes to slow their progress. You don't want any uphill sections if you're coming down by gravity. But you'll notice right at the bottom, there's a bump in the graph. And that's the original route of the tramway went through Clipiau, just outside here. In fact, it just passed right outside where we are, and then dropped down that very steep hill, past Bethania Chapel, down to the station. And there's an interesting story which I'll tell in a moment about exactly why they chose this rather counterintuitive and ridiculous route for the tramway. Eventually they bypassed that, and the green line shows the second route of the tramway through the village, which was much more suitable for horse and gravity work. So I want to talk about the people, because I think the people who created and ran and fought over and used the tramway these are the most interesting pieces of the story. So I'm going to tell you about two people called Edmund Buckley. This is going to get confusing. It confused me for a long time about who these people were, but I'll try and explain. This rather fabulous gentleman is Sir Edmund Buckley. He became a very, very wealthy man through industry in Manchester. He came from very poor beginnings. He did not inherit family wealth, but he was an incredibly successful cotton mill owner, and in fact diversified out into canals and railways and quarries and coal mines and all sorts of other industry. But he made his money as one of the very early Manchester cotton mill owners. And he was said to be the richest man in Manchester in the sort of around the 1850s, which was quite, Manchester was at that time an exploding city. It was sort of the Silicon Valley of the UK, of the Industrial Revolution. And so to be the richest of all of the industrialists in Manchester meant he made a lot of money. He was also very interesting. He became the Tory MP for a rotten borough of Newcastle under Lyme at the time. That was, he became MP by buying votes. So he was not truly an elected MP, but that's what you did when you were a rich industrialist from Manchester. You bought yourself a nice, safe parliamentary seat. He was a high Anglican, he was a Tory, he was a Jacobite, meaning he actually wanted to replace the royal family with the Stuarts. Was involved in some very shady dealings around the Jacobite cause, which was very much sort of underground at the time. He was described as the most clubbable man in Manchester, meaning he joined all of these drinking clubs and ran them, and he was the secretary for John Shaw's Club, which was this very licentious drinking club in Manchester. He had 16 illegitimate children by many different women. He just flouted convention. We think of the Victorians as these very kind of conventional, straight-jacketed people. He just didn't care. He was rich enough that none of that mattered to him. He just did whatever he wanted. And it was very much in the fashion for the rich industrialists to go out and find a country estate. This is what you did when you'd made your money, is you would go and buy a country estate and you would become lord of the manor. And that's what he did. He bought the Malmesbury estate, which for about the equivalent of about £3 million. It was initially 12,000 acres, centred on Dinas Malmesbury. He actually owned the town of Dinas Malmesbury. All of Dinas Malmesbury was his, plus 12,000 acres surrounding it, all the way down to Aberangell. And he was titled Lord of Malmesbury. Part of buying this estate enabled him to take the title of Lord of Malmesbury. So he was the Lord of Malmesbury. Interesting chap. His son, confusingly also called Sir Edmund Buckley, is this rather funny-looking guy. He was originally born as Edmund Peck, so he was the first Edmund Buckley's 16 illegitimate children, and clearly the favourite son. He was also extremely wayward. There are letters from Father Edmund to son Edmund, like berating him for staying out all night, not being serious, spending all his money. So he was definitely somebody who was kind of not seen as a good Victorian son. So in order to try and tame the younger Edmund's sort of wild ways, his father gave him, because this is what you do, right? His father gave him Dinas Malmesbury and the Malmesbury estate as a present. So the younger Sir Edmund becomes Lord of Malmesbury. In 1864, so he gets the estate in 1861. In 1864, his father gets a parliamentary decree to officially change his surname to Buckley, so that he could be recognised as Edmund Buckley, even though he was illegitimate. This is quite difficult to do when you're a high Victorian, but when you're the richest guy in Manchester, almost anything is possible. It's this Sir Edmund who puts forward the parliamentary bill that allows the building of the Malmesbury Railway. He also becomes the MP for Newcastle under Lyme, following his father. So his father buys him Newcastle under Lyme as a present as well. In 1868, he's made a baronet for his services to, actually it's not very clear what, I think just being rich is probably what he was made a baronet for. And in 1868, he builds Plaza Dinas, which is the enormous Gothic mansion in Dinas Mawddwy. It's not there anymore. It burnt down in mysterious circumstances at the start of the 20th century. But it truly was a vast and impressive and ridiculous place. It employed more people than lived in Dinas Mawddwy. It was spectacular, and huge gardens, and he had greenhouses put in and steam heating. It was an amazing thing. He was spending money like it was going out of fashion. And as I mentioned, in 1876 he goes bankrupt. So he has inherited the largest inheritance of any Manchester industrialist. He's taken that 12,000 acres and expanded it to 40,000 acres of mid-Wales he owns by the time he goes bankrupt. Everywhere from Bala all the way down to Aberangell, east and west, he owns a vast stretch of countryside. And he goes bankrupt having spent every last penny of his inheritance and £52 million beyond that. It was pretty spectacular. And so in 1876, his estate is split up and sold. And he, the Minthling quarry, which is the quarry up at Dinas Mawddwy, is sold to William Bullock, who comes from Macclesfield, who is a silk mill owner, and he co-owns a silk mill in Leek with Dennis Bradwell, who's the mayor of Congleton and also a mill owner. Not as wealthy as the Buckleys, but certainly very well to do. And through this connection to William Bullock, who had actually bought Minthling before the Great Sale, Dennis and his younger brother Jacob decide to buy Hendre Ddu Quarry. They see the opportunity for this newly established slate mine. They think it's going to be very profitable, and they purchase it from Sir Edmund Buckley in the auction. It's Dennis Bradwell, or the Bradwell brothers, who build Cefn Hall, which is about a mile that way. And it's positioned to overlook the tramway so that they can see all the trains going back and forward and make sure that their workers are getting to work on time. And they're very much kind of, we're going to like keep a careful eye on what you're doing. They put the first telegraph in up to the quarry so that they can check that the quarrymen are checking in when they should do and starting work at the time they're meant to. And in particular, most Welsh slate quarries were run on what's called the bargain system, which meant that a small group of men, there were men underground obtaining the slate, and then they had partners in the mill who were actually turning the slate into finished products. And they saw themselves very much as skilled, craftspeople who knew what they were doing, who could find the best quality rock and work it into the best quality products. The Bradwells didn't like that. They were used to, in their mills, their silk mills, in having a clocking on system where each individual worker was separated out from the others. They clocked in, they clocked out. The quarrymen didn't like this at all, and there was an enormous industrial dispute between the Bradwells and the quarrymen. The Bradwells were so hated locally that Jacob Bradwell famously refused to ride up the incline that connected the tramway up to the quarry at Hendre Ddu, because he was scared the quarryman would accidentally let the brake off and let him fall to his death. So instead he had this special harness made, and fortunately no pictures of this survive, so I don't know exactly what it looked like, but I'm glad I kind of only have to imagine it and have never had to see it. But he had this sort of leather harness made, and he would have a horse waiting for him at the top of the tramway, and his trusted manservant would lead the horse up, dragging him along sort of on his heels in this leather harness up the path that ran beside the incline, which must have been an extraordinary sight. And all because he had such a mistrust of his men. So somewhat interesting character. Frederick Walton, yet another industrialist from England. There's another rich English industrialist who wants to come in and play lord. Walton's actually kind of interesting. His father, James Walton, was a noted inventor and had built several improvements to what's called the carding system, which is part of the cotton mill process, and become quite rich. They were based in Hortondale, which is just outside of Manchester. And James, the father, purchased the Cwmllwyd estate in 1860. His son Frederick, and this is Frederick here later in his life, is the inventor of linoleum. He was a great experimenter. He came across the product which we now know as the linoleum flooring. And he invented it and made a huge fortune of his own as a result of that. And he sold it in America and just very successful. And he took over Cwmllwyd in 1868 and built the house there, the Plas Cwmllwyd. And in 1883 he built this school. So he gave the land, he owned this bit of Aberangell, and he gave the land for the school, and he had it all built, so he built it on his own expense, and he paid for the teachers for 3 years to get the school up and running. So he's the person who built the building we're in now. He was, he was an industrialist at heart, and he wanted in on the sort of the local boom industry of slate quarrying. So in 1888, he opened the quarry at Meisig-Amfer in partnership with Edward Hurst Davis, who's, for me, the sort of one of the heroes of this story. So we'll talk about Edward Hurst Davis in a second. There was a conflict. Walton distrusted Davis. Walton spent most of his time in London, in one of his many homes in London, and he was suspected that Davis was siphoning off money and ripping him off, basically. Davis was very smart, kept meticulous books, and was able to show that no, he wasn't. He was running the quarry completely soundly. But they never really repaired their relationship, and the partnership was dissolved in 1900, leaving Edward Hurst Davis in charge of Meisig-Amfer. So let me tell you about Edward. He's a really interesting guy. This rather blurry photo is only the second one he's in the bowler hat that I know of him, apart from that one I showed you right at the beginning on the tramway. His father, Edward Davis, was the first manager at Hendre Ddu Quarry. So he was the first, what they called the practical man. In other words, not the person with money, but the person actually running the quarry day to day. He died quite young. And in 1880, his son, Edward Hurst Davis, was appointed the manager at Hendre Ddu. So he starts out as manager at Hendre Ddu Quarry. He fell out with the Bradwells because the Bradwells were trying to introduce all sorts of ways of working that Edward Hurst did not approve of. And so in 1882, he starts as the quarry agent at Garthaniog, which has just opened up. And then in 1886, he goes into partnership with Frederick Walton, who we've just seen, and together they open up Meisig-Amfer Quarry, which is on the Broad Vein and which is sort of up in the hills to the north. Now they had a problem, Meisig-Amfer had a problem, which was it was a very isolated location and they couldn't get their slate to market. And it doesn't matter how good your slate is and how good the products are, if you can't get it to market, your business will fail. And so they needed access to the Hendre Ddu Tramway in order to get their goods to market. So they went into a long negotiation with the rather combative Bradwell brothers in order to get an agreement to gain access to the tramway. And the interesting thing is that Walton owned Aberangell Meadows, which is the land immediately to the west of the village, over which was the obvious route for the tramway to come into the station. But James Walton had refused to let the Buckleys cross his land, and that's why they had to take the rather strange route up and over Clippiau and down into the village. And so Walton, it was very much now in Frederick Walton's interest to allow the tramway across his land in exchange for access to the tramway. And this is the agreement that he reached with the Bradwells. And he had built this very spectacular house, Bryn Derwin, which is just down the road, for him and his family. The tramway passed right in front of it, and he was able to make a lot of money through his very successful quarry at Meisig-Gamver. Davis was really interesting. He was the first chairman of Dinas Mawddwy Council when that was created. He was very active in local schools. He ran a lot of schools, did a lot of good works. He spent a lot of his time helping to improve Aberangell and Dinas Mawddwy and really making these successful, modern, well-educated communities. He cared deeply about the local people in a way that the Bradwells and the Waltons just really didn't, because he was a local man, because he grew up here. He was a Welshman who cared about his community, and he was, I think, a really outstanding person. He bought, in 1908, Jacob Bradwell, the surviving Bradwell brother, died, and Edward Hurst Davis bought Hendre Ddu Quarry and the tramway. So at different points, he owns or is manager of all the major quarries and the tramway. So he really is this very successful, very shrewd businessman who manages to own all of the major activities leading up into the First World War. The First World War was not good to the Davis family. His son John, his eldest son John, was wounded in France in 1915 and very nearly died. His younger son, Iorwerth, was a notable fighter pilot during the First World War, survived the war, was a training pilots at the end of the war, and was killed in an air crash in Essex just after the war had ended. So he made it all the way through the First World War as a fighter pilot, a tremendously dangerous occupation, and then was killed in an accident at a training school in Essex right after the end of the war. And I think this is the thing that really breaks Edward Hurst Davis, the death of his son. He had been a lifetime teetotaler. He'd been very active in the teetotal movement here. After the war, he started drinking heavily after the loss of his son. And really, I think that loss is what really kind of broke him as a man. He ended up selling Hendre Ddu, and the last thing that he did in the village before his death in 1921 was he built what's called Building Davis, which is these two sheds down by the road coming into the village. And those were really sort of the last things that he did before his death. But I think he's a genuinely remarkable person. He was known for his, not only his great knowledge of quarrying, but also as an incredibly shrewd businessman who made a lot of money at a time when it was very difficult for Welsh people to be successful in the quarries, which were often dominated by the English, particularly the smaller quarries. And he succeeded in a remarkable way, and I think he's a really interesting person. I want to tell you about the swindlers. We're going to switch gears now and talk about what happened at Hendre Ddu and Garthainiog just after the First World War. The war ends. There's this great feeling of we can do anything that swept across Britain in the very early 1920s. There was a great need to rebuild because there was a lot of housing stock that needed rebuilding, and there was also very lax rules and regulations around the sale of stock in companies. So there's a very interesting character called Roland Morgan. He goes by many different names. He used many aliases throughout his life, but I think Roland Morgan is his real name as far as I can tell. He was born in the 1870s. Before the First World War, in the 1890s through to 1911, he ran a set of stock swindles across the south of England, was declared bankrupt at least twice, was never quite caught as a swindler, although his name was published in the papers, and he was clearly setting up fake companies and selling stock in them to gullible people and running off with the money. In 1916, after his second bankruptcy, or maybe his third, I'm not sure, he moved back to Birmingham, where he had grown up, and started running, again, a series of these fake businesses, a fake colliery, all sorts of interesting swindles. We'll come back to Roland Morgan in a second. Let's talk about William Clayton Russon. Born at about the same time, also from Birmingham. Before the First World War, he ran a series of bicycle businesses. Bicycle building at the time was very, very popular. It was sort of a great boom in the 1890s and the 1900s. All of them failed. All of them fell into bankruptcy. This is starting to sound familiar. In 1912, Russon's mother, for reasons which aren't entirely clear, set up a woodworking company in Birmingham called Ryland Manufacturing. It actually turns out to be a successful business. They're building cabinets, they're building bodies for cars, or early automobiles, all sorts of interesting things out of wood. In 1916, Roland Morgan and William Clayton Russon get together and take over Ryland Manufacturing from William's mother. It's not clear whether she was entirely a willing partner in this. There's some sense that they may have sort of blackmailed her into handing over the business. It's all a bit unclear. But anyway, Morgan and Russon are running this woodworking business in Birmingham. They form a company called British Timber Plantations and start buying forests around Aberystwyth, because they want to be able to control the supply of timber for their woodworking company. In 1919, William Clayton Russon buys Hendre Ddu, the quarry and the tramway, from Edward Hurst Davis. He buys it for £48,000 and immediately turns around and sells it to a new company that's formed called the National Welsh Slate Quarries for £180,000. It's a tidy profit. This happens within the space of a month. He, by the way, is a director of National Welsh Slate Quarries, although under somewhat shady circumstances. And another director of the company is a gentleman called William Rhodes Speller. William Rhodes Speller is Roland Morgan. Roland Morgan can't use his real name because he's a bankrupt, and so he uses this pseudonym, which happens to be almost exactly the same name as another of the directors of the company. Very strange. And so he's appointed a director of this company. It takes over Hendre Ddu, and they restart operations after the First World War, pump an enormous amount of money in because they raise millions of pounds in capital from the general public, and they actually do invest in the company, and they relay part of the tramway, and they put new equipment into the slate mills, and they obviously do try and actually run it. Meanwhile, there's a separate company, or actually, as it turns out, not a separate company, but in theory a separate company called the Standard Housing Company, which buys Garthaniog for £150,000 from William Clayton Russon's son-in-law, who's bought it at a cut-rate price. He pays £20,000 for it and sells it on to his father-in-law's new company for £150,000, financed by sale of stock in the Standard Housing Company. The Standard Housing Company buys the plantations near Aberystwyth that from Morgan and Russon for another £47,000, and the slate quarries at Llangainog for another £50,000. By 1922, so 1 year later, both of these companies go into receivership. They fail. They're tremendous business failures. Morgan and Russell are declared bankrupt, but both of them have, by the way, transferred all of that money that they got at the setting up of these companies go to their wives. And once they go to their wives, they can't be touched because the law at the time says it's only the person who's like bankrupt who can be touched. If the money's in your wife's name, that can't be used to pay off your debts. So they declare bankruptcy and walk away from their debts. Clearly, something is going on here. Both of these families end up with, in today's terms, tens of millions of pounds, which is extracted from the public through sale of stock, in companies that immediately fail, and the money is squirreled away with their spouses, and they declare bankruptcy and walk away. Morgan goes on to buy Wivenhoe Hall in Essex, which is a very grand house near Colchester. But eventually his many misdeeds catch up with him, and he ends up in 1930 being sentenced to 18 months hard labour for his stock swindles. He sort of, that's the end of his career after 1930. William Clayton Russon, by the way, excuse me, gives his son, also called William Clayton Russon, inherits a huge amount of money, buys a grand mansion at Glanmawddach near Dolgelly, and goes on to become a lord in his own right, is knighted, sets up this seed company that's incredibly successful called R.G. Cuthbert's, and becomes this, one of the great and the good. All of the money, by the way, comes from here, from the swindles that they ran on the two slate quarries just outside the valley. Very interesting stories, and there's a lot more to it than I'm telling you here. It's a very convoluted and interesting pattern of behaviour that these two fine gentlemen get up to. One of my favourite characters in this whole story is a gentleman called Temple Hadrill. First of all, I like that name. Who wouldn't want to be called Temple Hadrill? He's a Canadian fighter pilot in the First World War. He is shot down by Werner Voss, who's one of the most famous, but beyond the Red Baron is kind of like the most famous of the German fighter pilots. Shot down over Germany and taken prisoner, and sees out the rest of the war as an officer in German prison camps, which I think was actually not that terrible of an experience in the First World War, at least. And after the war, decides that he's going to settle in Sevenoaks and set up as an engineer. And for some reason which is not entirely clear, although I got some clues about why maybe he did this, he decides in 1931 to lease Garthanyog Quarry from the Russons. So Gertrude Russon, who's the wife of William Clayton Russon, who has all the money, is theoretically in charge of Garthanyog. She leases it to Temple Hadrill. He makes lifelong friends with Bill Milnes, who's at the time the chief engineer at Hendre Ddu, and together they install an enamelling plant, a slate enamelling plant at Garthanyog, so they can extend the range of products that they can produce to include enamelled products, which are very popular at the time, particularly for electrical switchboards, as well as for sort of bathtubs and these beautifully enamelled fire surrounds that you sometimes see made out of slate. It doesn't go well for him. He's a tremendous engineer, but not a great businessman. It's very clear that he struggles on the sort of financial side. And by the summer of 1933, he realizes that this enterprise is dragging him down, and he's going to go bankrupt pretty quickly if he doesn't get out of it. So he asks the Russons whether he can buy himself out of the lease that he has on the quarry. The Russons laugh and say, no, we're going to enforce the lease. You better keep paying us until you have all of your money is gone. And so Bill Milnes, the Hendre Ddu engineer, and Temple Hadrill, the decorated fighter pilot, hatch a plan. They realize that the quarry will be worthless without its equipment, without the enamelling equipment, without the slate planing machines, without all of the machinery in the mills. So what they do is they, in the cover of night, run a train up to Garthaniog Quarry. They start loading all of the quarry equipment, all the mill equipment onto this train, and they take it up to Hendre Ddu. And the Russens get word of this. Their son comes charging out of their house in Aberangell, running up to say, hey, you can't take the quarry equipment. But they manage to get it up into the mills at Hendre Ddu. They take it up the exit incline. They've got a train of heavy slabs waiting to be able to pull all this equipment up. They put it into the mill at Hendre Ddu. And William Clayton Russen kind of comes with great indignation, like, what are you doing? You've stolen my equipment. They say, no, this is our equipment. We put the equipment in. If you want it back, you can release me from the contract. And Russen is over a barrel. He has no choice. He has to say, okay, I'll release you from the contract. You put all the machinery back, because the mill is useless. The quarry is useless without the machinery to actually process the slate. So it's a very smart move. And Milnes and Hadrell remained great friends until they died, long after they had finished working in the quarries here. Hadrell is very interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, he goes on to form a company called Hadrell and Horseman in 1946, which builds counterpoise lamps. Very, very stylish. Now very sought after. They go for enormous amount of money. They're great collector's items. The other reason that it is interesting, when I was researching the book, I tried to get in touch with members of the families involved, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I actually got in touch with Temple Hadrell's daughter, who's still alive. So this is the daughter of a First World War fighter pilot. And she's still alive and living in Maine in the US. We continue to be friends, and we exchange birthday cards and gifts. And she's a remarkable person. Temple remarried. This is his second wife. He remarried in the 1950s when he was quite old, and had a second family, which is how his daughter is still with us. She's a remarkable artist in her own right. I greatly enjoy getting to know her, but to actually talk to the daughter of a First World War pilot, that's actually quite a rare thing. It's quite a privilege, and just one of the friendships that I've made in researching the book. It's been a real joy. And then T. Glyn Williams. I mentioned him earlier. T. Glyn Williams comes in right at the end of the Hendre Ddu story. He's the son of T.O. Williams, who owned or managed many of the quarries across mid and North Wales, notably both Aberthyfeni and Bregorch in the Corris area, but also Abercorris, but also Ysgan, which is up in Blaenau Ffestiniog. And in fact, the Williams family, the extended Williams family, are very successful. They have machinery dealerships, they have quarries, they have all sorts of industrial enterprises related to slate quarrying across mid and North Wales. Very interesting family. And he's the youngest son of T.O. Williams. In 1937, he buys Hendre Ddu Quarry here and attempts to run it. He's 21 at the time, I think. Remarkable. The quarry by this time is almost worked out. He starts to do what's called pillar robbing, which is where he starts to take slate from the pillars that hold the roofs up. It's a very dangerous thing to do, because you risk collapsing the chambers onto you. It happens quite a lot, particularly in smaller quarries, particularly towards the end of their lives, when they don't have the quarry owners don't have the capital to invest in developing new chambers, so they try and take slate from the pillars of the existing chambers. He's at one point brings in some experienced people from his family from Blaenau Ffestiniog to come and look at the quarry, and they say, "Oh, you don't want to be doing that. What do you think you're doing? You just stop." He keeps running the quarry into the start of the Second World War. He has to close in 1941, mostly because most of his men have been called up or volunteered to go into the army. He tries to reopen the quarry in 1946, but can't do so, can't raise the capital to do so, leaves the area, goes up to Blaenau Ffestiniog, where he runs an incredibly successful quarrying operation, ends up owning Oakley Quarry, which is the largest underground slate mine in the world, as well as a fleet of lorry, so that you'll still see Teagle and Williams lorries running around. So he goes on to a huge success, but his starting point is Hendre Ddu. And just to give you an idea, this is a little hard to read, but just some of the many connections to Aberangell across the United Kingdom that we see, whether it's the Buckleys and Higginbotham from Liverpool and Manchester, whether it's Bowley and others who buy the quarries after the disaster of National Wealth Site Quarries from Melton Mowbray, Russon and Morgan and a number of others who come from Birmingham, and I refer to as the Birmingham Mafia. They're very shady characters. The last owners of Garthaniog are a company called S. Bowley and Son, who are related to William Bowley, who come from London. It's remarkable how interconnected this place is through its industry right across Britain. Although this is hard to read, this is one of the ways that I've kind of tried to visualize all of the connections. So all of the different people who are involved with and own the quarries from the 1890s to the end of quarrying. And you can see so this magenta line is Roland Morgan's involvement going out after his swindling. William Clayton Russon in the orange is very interconnected to both of the quarries. You've got Edward Hurst Davis in this green colour, and you can see his connections all the way through out here. It's really interesting how complex the web of ownership and control of these quarries is in just such a small area, and all of the reasons why you have all of these different companies and how they all connect together. So if you're interested, I'd recommend my book, as I sort of obliged to do. A very brief look at the quarries. I go into some detail and have attempted to talk about the history and the development of the quarries themselves. These are various shots of Garthaniog. This is from 1913. This is the enamelling shed that was built after the Second World War. This is one of the few views inside the mill. This is a view of the really quite substantial underground chambers at Garthaniog. It's a pretty interesting place. This gentleman here is Temple Hadrell. So this is during his period of ownership, and you can again see these vast chambers, and he's sort of taking some visitors around. Inside the enamelling shed, some of the local quarrymen, I tell you a little bit about their stories. Richard Lewis, this gentleman is particularly interesting. He works in many of the quarries here and several of the ones in Corris, and he's a very interesting character. A little view of Meisy Gamford. Meisy Gamford was one of the more interesting quarries to try and research. It closed in 1914. The earliest photograph that I know of it is from 1970. By which time it was already a ruin. This is a photograph of the remains of the mill as they are now. And so I attempted to reconstruct, and I'm sure this is not entirely accurate, but it's the best that I could do from this kind of evidence, what the mill looked like. I managed to get some local contemporary descriptions of the mill building. It's really quite unusual. But I think that's a relatively accurate depiction of it. And this photograph on the right is the upper pit at Meisy Gamford, and the gentleman on the right in the rather natty straw boater is Frederick Walton on one of his visits. He had this sort of commemorative photograph. If you go and look at the photograph, it's hard to see here. If you look at the photograph in the book, there's, I think, 8 or 9 quarrymen on the rock face. At first you don't see them, and then you start to see them dotted around. And the Hendre Ddu, which is by far the largest and sort of most complex of the quarries in the area. This is sort of a general overview, the tramway coming in over on the left. the exit incline, so the large incline going up to the quarry level, a very large mill. There's a second incline inside the quarry. There's a series of open pits underneath the reservoirs which drove the mill machinery, and then four underground levels. Adits into the underground chambering. It is a remarkable place. These are some of the images from the book. Both the mills from the 1920s, underground views from similar periods. So these are, what it was, working conditions within the quarry, within the mine. Again, I've attempted, with the help of several of the people here and others, to actually construct. There are no remaining surveys of the underground workings, so sort of put together an attempt at sort of the layout of the underground workings, which are quite extensive. That's a figure, that's somebody here. And you can see the size of some of these workings and the really challenging conditions that the miners faced in some of these caverns. And you can see in this photograph some of the enormous, like multi-ton blocks of slate that have fallen from the roof. It remains a very unstable environment, and don't go underground unless you really know what you're doing. I'm going to finish off with two stories that I particularly have enjoyed coming across in researching my book. In the top right is Robert Newton playing Long John Silver in the 1950 movie Treasure Island. He's from the West Country of England, and he used when he played Long John Silver, sort of the classic pirate. He used an exaggerated version of his native accent in the movie. And this is why we now think pirates go, "Ah, my hearties." It's because that's what he said, that's what he sounded like, because that was his accent. And pirates didn't talk like that. But the movie was so popular and had such an impact worldwide that we now think that pirates talk that way because of his one role as Long John Silver. Now, why? It's interesting, right? But what has this got to do with Aberangell? In 1929, Newton, who, by the way, was an infamous womanizer and I think had 5 or 6 wives across his lifetime, but his first wife is this lady called Petra Walton, and she's the granddaughter of Frederick Walton. Their marriage didn't last long. It lasted 6 years. They had one daughter who is, I believe, still alive. And Petra grew up here. She's a local. She grew up in Cwmlwcoediog, which was her family home, and most likely rode on the Hendre Ddu Tramway during her lifetime. After her marriage to Newton failed in 1935, she returned to Aberangell, having had the glamorous life of Hollywood. And in the Second World War, she ran essentially a soup kitchen to support the local people, which she paid for largely out of her own money. All the way through the war, she cooked meals for people every day for the locals, and is, I think, very fondly remembered in the village. Some of you may even remember and have heard of her. So there's a real connection between Aberangell and the fact that we think pirates say, "Ah, me hearties." And then a slightly more sinister potential connection. I've not been able to prove this, and it's full of rumour, but it's Jack the Ripper. So Edward Hurst Davis's sister Elizabeth moved to London in 1876. She fell out with her father and decided to move to London. What we do know is that she became a prostitute in a high-class London brothel. And in 1885, she disappeared. She had a short marriage to a rather shady character, and then she disappears. There's a gentleman called Wyn Weston Davis, who's actually a descendant of Edward Hurst Davis, so he's one of the Davis family. And he thinks that Elizabeth is Mary Jane Kelly, so that she resumes her life as a prostitute after her short marriage, goes into the East End of London, assumes the name Mary Jane Kelly, and we know that Mary Jane Kelly is the Ripper's last victim. Now, not everyone agrees with this theory. It is a theory. He's actually trying to get her disinterred so he can do a DNA test to prove whether it is or is not Elizabeth Davis, but it might be. Certainly we know that Mary Jane Kelly spoke Welsh, and so it's plausible that Edward Hurst Davis's sister was the last victim of Jack the Ripper. She, by the way, was killed 800 feet from the London office of the Hendre Ddu Slate Quarry. Make of that what you will. There's another potential connection to Jack the Ripper. Frederick Walton's daughter, Olive, marries a character called Herbert Vivian. Herbert Vivian was a notorious monarchist. He later, between the wars, became very enamoured of Mussolini and took up the fascist cause. So he was a very dubious character. He was a Jacobite, so we may remember that the first Sir Edmund Buckley was a Jacobite, wanted to restore the Stuarts to the throne. Well, so was Herbert Vivian. Herbert and Olive Vivian toured across Europe. They were very early proponents of the Serbian nationalists. And one of the things that they did is they founded a magazine called The Whirlwind, which was a notorious Jacobite newspaper in the 1890s. It was Herbert Vivian was the first person to interview, the first journalist ever to interview Winston Churchill. He very interesting and scandalous life. The Whirlwind had Walter Sickert, who is the gentleman in the bottom right, as their house artist. And Sickert was fascinated with the Ripper murders. He went and stayed in one of the rooms that the Ripper used to kill one of his victims. Deliberately, he actually wanted to do that, and has did several paintings of the victims. He was fascinated by this, and several people have said that he's a plausible Jack the Ripper. He may have been the Ripper himself. He was certainly quite psychotic. So two connections, potentially, between this small place, a village that's never had more than 500 people living in it, to Jack the Ripper. Once you start looking at somewhere as deeply fascinating as Aberangell and starting to look at the histories and look at the people particularly and what they did and why they did it, you start to find all of these fascinating connections. And it has been a great privilege of mine to be able to dig into all of this history with the help of several people in this room and many outside it. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming along tonight. I hope this has been interesting. For those of you who live here, you are truly privileged to live in such a beautiful and special place. It's become very near and dear to my heart. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. It's been a great pleasure.